Welcome to the Regeneration International podcast.
So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next panelist, Ben Dobson. Ben Dobson has owned and managed several farms throughout the Northeast. In 2007, Ben founded Atlantic Organics, which was the largest organic fresh vegetable farm in the state of Maine. Between his farm and his other venture, Locally Known, Ben provided the first 100% East Coast grown and packaged organic salads for sale to the broader retail market in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. Ben has also worked in the Dominican Republic, where he learned about the production and export of organic bananas, coffee, and mangoes, and he developed an organic coffee business in Haiti. Ben has recently been working as farm manager for Stonehouse Farm, a producer of certified organic and non-GMO grains for cover crop seed, human consumption, and livestock feed, as well as the chief executive officer for Hudson Hemp. But he is now able to focus most of his attention on Hudson Carbon, an on-farm soil laboratory studying how organic regenerative farming can maximize carbon capture and restore ecosystems. The goal is to pay farmers for carbon sequestration by selling carbon offsets directly from farms. Ben, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a wonderful to see you and join you all today.
Great. So I want to ask you some sort of tough questions to get started about carbon credits and carbon offsets, because there isn't really consensus in the climate movement around these things yet. And Organic Consumers Association, we've joined some coalitions around the Growing Climate Solutions Act and some big government solutions that are geared towards putting together cap and trade programs. Because our concern is that if the government is trying to regulate fossil fuel polluters, but they're letting them wiggle out of that by buying offsets, then we're never really going to get the corporations to reduce their fossil fuel pollution. On the other hand, I want to see regenerative organic farmers get paid for the carbon sequestration that we all benefit from, because I see, we need to get to neutral and then to negative, and we need to start pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and regenerative organic agriculture is the only way to do it. So what do you say to these concerns in terms of what you're doing at Hudson Carbon?
Absolutely. It's a terrific question. I think it starts I'm going to start at a high level, is that there needs to be an explicit goal. We talk about getting to net zero by 2050, but that means that all the way to 2050, we would continue to be adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And the cap and trade is limiting an amount of pollution. It's not actually reversing pollution. And I think that we need to first think of the context, and without leadership, we at least need to start our own smaller scale efforts in a way where we are stating what the overall goal should be. Our goal should be an atmosphere with balanced carbon dioxide within this century. And to get there, we need to have a price on carbon that is high enough that polluters who burn carbon, like oil companies, it needs to get too expensive to use those fossil fuels. And the money needs to be then paid to those who are bringing carbon back in. So I absolutely do believe a carbon market mechanism could work. We just haven't talked about the context right. So the carbon cycle is the cycle that made this earth habitable for us. When the planet 5 billion years ago, our atmosphere was mostly CO2, and the first photosynthetic microbes and plants was the first step of life. They started with photosynthesis, and they started adding oxygen to the atmosphere and holding carbon on the Earth's surface. All the way, fast forward to 200 years ago, down to 280 parts per million. So we actually need to value carbon being brought into the ground in forests and wetlands and ecosystems and regeneratively managed soils, and we need the polluters to pay for it. If polluters aren't paying just a small amount to one another to cap their amount of pollution, but actually have to pay a very large amount for every unit of pollutant they let out, and that money is paid to the solution directly, you create a double down effect where when it's expensive, you would emit less and the sequesters would be more encouraged at a higher price to do the activities that sequester carbon, like with Regeneration agave in Mexico, planting agaves, replanting bamboo forests, etc. So I think that the context is essential. But we don't have that context yet. So I think that we as aligned organizations, many of us like those at Regeneration International, Hudson Carbon, and as many other partners we can find, need to say, okay, the goal needs to be to a balanced atmosphere. And the goal needs to be that polluters all they're on the hook, not only for what they're emitting now, but if we want to get back to 350 parts per million, that means that all the emissions since we were at 350 parts per million 40 years ago need to be paid for as well. So I think there's actually, instead of environmental justice groups and carbon pricing groups being against each other, we can join as long as we set the context and the solution right. We have a temporal justice of extra carbon to bring down, and moving forwards, we need to make sure it's too expensive to pollute, and it's too good of an opportunity not to sequester. Now, in markets now, that isn't the case. Most carbon markets now are built by the polluters themselves. So you have sort of band-aid solutions in regenerative. People are calling, GMO crop systems with a little no-till and maybe some cover crops regenerative, but the soybeans and corn are still going to feedlots or being shipped overseas. So that's the sort of corporate gold rush mentality to carbon markets. I think if we take a longer view and they don't have a real solution, as long as we present a real solution, and even if it's at a micro level, a local level, as long as we're thinking in that context and communicating it, I think the movement will grow. And a lot of these issues of sort of self-serving interests, talking about offsetting and regenerative agriculture, and just a cap and trade market wouldn't be sufficient. So that would be my answer. I think I could take up the whole half hour continuing to answer that question, but I would leave it there for now.
Well, that's good. And also, I think that there are a lot of, it's not just, if you could mute when I'm talking, then we won't have an echo. It's not just polluters and fossil fuel companies that are looking for offsets. There are a lot of do-getting organizations, and they don't always know how to find the best offsets. Like, just to pick on one local grocery store that I absolutely love. It's my favorite organic grocery store. But they advertised taking offsets that were actually, the offsets themselves were just polluters saying that they were going to pollute a little bit less. And it wasn't, so that's not really an offset. That's not carbon being sucked out of the atmosphere. That's just a little bit less carbon theoretically going up into the atmosphere. And so I feel like, if there's a market for carbon offsets at all, then we need to make sure that that market is going to the regenerative organic farmers, who are the only ones who can actually do this for real.
We're actually focused on this at Hudson Carbon and working with a group of stakeholder farms, and where we've been doing carbon measurements, but also biodiversity protocol and understanding water infiltration. And some projects we know when they started, what they had for carbon and where they're getting to, but we're starting a mechanism to actually help fund projects up front, where they'll be offering a token for good work already done, and a commitment to continue with the practices being used for another 10 years. With an initial, they'll onboard with us with a carbon baseline and ecosystem baseline measurements. And then from there, they're committing to practices, so an investor in that token knows that they're likely to gain carbon credits and other ecosystem services attached to that property over the upcoming years. And we're partnering only with farms who grow real food, regeneratively and organically, for people to eat. And it's a map-based program, so that those who want to offset will be able to come to Hudson Carbon and almost look like an Airbnb website at what farms and who they're interested in, and choose the place they want to work with for their ecological asset investments. I'm calling it that because a true place is much more than just carbon. It represents a whole grouping of activities of biodiversity, of good food for the community, of carbon sequestration. And these hubs need to be considered the most precious types of assets in the world. So we're calling them ecological asset investments. So we're saying invest, not offset, because that's really what we're asking society to do, is to invest in the solution and be a stakeholder in it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've been a little bit concerned about what the USDA has proposed because they proposed a very, very small price per ton for carbon sequestration. So the US Department of Agriculture agrees that we should pay farmers for carbon sequestration, but they were talking about something in the range of like $20 per ton. And I don't think that that's enough to get people to adopt this sincerely regenerative organic practices. What are your thoughts on that? How high a price of carbon do we need to get adoption? Or maybe that's not even how it works in your system.
I think that carbon is a good proxy. And then, so you can measure carbon, but make sure you don't onboard projects that are causing pollution down the line with what they're selling, spraying chemicals that's killing. So you can use carbon as a proxy. I'm not running away from carbon as fast as some, but you have to look at everything else in that system to assess whether it's good for water, good for biodiversity. I think that price is way too low, to answer your question. To get a farm interested, our average on our regenerative farm has been 6 tons of carbon dioxide sequestered per year. If we got paid $20 per ton, that would be $120 an acre, which is a decent amount of money, but we could get a wholesale shift in farming practices if carbon prices went up above $50 a ton, but really they need to be at 100 or more. And if we were to have a market like we talked about earlier, then at $100 a ton, that price would really make people not want to pollute. It'd be too expensive. And it would really make people want to engage in sequestering carbon and farming regeneratively. There's also good precedent for that in running up to the 2016 Paris Climate Accord. Kind of a surprising group of people that included Henry Baker and George Shultz, the old oil men. They said we're all going to die if we don't price carbon, and we suggest $40 in 2016 with a $20 increase per year. They're still touting this plan, but that would have left carbon at $120 a ton today. So I think that we're very much, if we're going to have real impact, we need to be at $100 per ton or more. And I'm using that sort of as a proxy for carbon as part of a system that's building more biodiversity, is better for the water, and producing good food. So we could call them ecological assets, so to speak, but with carbon as a baseline measure.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, so it does make me a little bit wary though when people, especially Wall Street types, get really excited about carbon markets, because in essence, like, Wall Street could run away with this and they could just create this market in hot air essentially and spin their wheels, make their money, but not create real change. What are your ideas for how to prevent Wall Street from running away with carbon markets?
It's a great question. And I don't want my answer to be controversial, but at first I'm going to say there aren't enough solutions. So Wall Street can try, but even with they're trying to sort of, many of the mainstream registries are in a way trying to rig their scientific methodologies. For example, they're only measuring carbon in the top 6 to 12 inches in their no-till conventional systems. Well, that's because if you go below 12 inches, those systems are actually losing carbon. So you've got to, there's some real tricky stuff going on. And I think it's going to be tough for Wall Street to cash in on this because Wall Street can't even fake that they know about ecosystems, in my mind, unless we can. So I feel like the impetus is on us. The problem with Wall Street, though, and the world, is that the most wealthy 1% of this world control 1/2 of the assets. And most of those assets are sitting in accounts in terms of fiat currency, money. But it's not, if they were to spend that money on buying real estate and goods, there would literally be nothing left for the rest of us or on 3 other planets. So all of this money actually has to move somewhere, because money is created in a way in this country that isn't rooted in real goods and production. It's created, a little bit of real money in your account allows your bank to create 30 times more money in loans to other people. So therefore, poof. So we have so much of that money now in a world without many resources that I actually think our movement has to show the finance world what actually works. Because much of the finance world does know one thing, that they won't even be alive in 100 years if they don't figure out this climate problem. And there's some real assholes who understand that now. Excuse my language. But I think that where the impetus is on us to show real science, real practices, and say, hey, these are ecological assets. And this indigenous community, you need to give them $2 billion to protect their forest and rebuild their area. And you know what? It's not going to give you a financial return. The return it gives you is some air, so that 100 years ago, your kids might get to inherit that money, or your grandkids. So I actually think that while I'm scared that Wall Street's getting involved, we do need to find a way to work with them to move that excess money on balance sheets into ecosystems. And that's at least better than it sitting up in some cloud, literally where they have it. With the rest of the funny money, it would make that extra money that can't be spent worth something real to the planet, to the communities living in ecosystems, and even to the very wealthy people and groups investing it. So I actually think there is a way to create a win-win-win, starting with ecosystems and communities on the ground. We just have to show Wall Street how that works. And some of the more reliable partners, I think, to start talking to are insurance funds, pension funds, and groups that are responsible for money, that have stakeholders. Like, when you're an insurance company, yeah, you're investing, but you have people that are insured, and you have a promise to them. If you're a pension fund, you have a promise to people. So there are tremendous pools of money that I think know they need to move to creative places. And then there are always the black magic, scorpions of the night, day traders and et cetera. And that's where I really do worry about carbon, is that those folks who are just creating money out of thin air, creating money out of carbon that doesn't even exist in thin air, and selling that. So this all could go wrong. But I think we can't run away from Wall Street. We need to engage directly by showing real solutions.
All right, I have one last question about how this works in financial markets. Right now, I've heard that we have $3 trillion worth of fossil fuels that are on the ledgers of ExxonMobil, et cetera, but cannot be burned because we would destroy the planet. So you were talking about how there's kind of an excess amount of capital on the ledger. Maybe that's one way to remove some of that, to trim that fat.
It's a terrific question. And a lot of people would, there's a lot of answers I could give. Some could be controversial, but I actually think that all carbon that's at risk of being burned needs to be paid to be held where it is. We need to pay for forests to be held where they are. We need to make sure that we're not digging it up anymore, and that extra oil isn't. Now, there's a transition. I drove a car today, but how do we come up with a strategy so that we're paying for not only fresh carbon being sequestered back into the earth, but existing carbon to stay where it is, whether it's a fossil reserve or a living carbon like a forest or an ecosystem. And so there's really, I think, 3 types of carbon credits. There's new carbon brought into regenerative lands. There's living carbon on the Earth's surface that needs to be paid to be protected. And there's fossil carbon and also bad activities that need to be stopped. And what's the payment structure for that? No one wants to pay out Exxon, but no matter what, we have to come up with financial solutions for all 3 of these pools of carbon. One to be regrown, the living pool to be protected, and the fossil fuel to be left where it is. And a price on carbon in the right place. Basically, if carbon is priced so that you get paid for carbon if you protect it or sequester it, and you have to pay for carbon if you're emitting it, would really, with one universal price, would really help us start to answer these questions in a clear way.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, now we'll talk about what we really love talking about, which is regenerative organic agriculture. So Ben, you have a lot of experience personally in this. And then in the next panel, we're going to be speaking with Will Harris of White Oak Pastures. We're going to be speaking with Reginaldo Hazlet-Marroquin with Regenerative Alliance. He does Regen Poultry. And we're also going to be talking with Ronnie Cummins of Via Organica. And I know you've been working with Ronnie on how to figure out how this Hudson Carbon system might work, where he is in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. He's working with a climate that is really challenging, but the local farmers there have come up with an amazing agroforestry system They're doing agave and other tree crops as a way to anchor the soil, but they figured out how to use the agave as an animal feed. So this is a climate and a landscape that isn't even really good for grazing goats. It just doesn't have enough green matter growing, but the agave thrives there, and these farmers have figured out a way to use it as an animal feed. So where does Hudson Carbon come into this picture?
Wonderful question. This is one of my favorite projects. I never knew this would happen. So Ronnie and we're good friends, and Ronnie 2 years ago, I think, said, "Hey, do you know much about agave?" I said, "Well, I love tequila." He said, "Well, no, it's actually, this is part of saving the world, man. This is how we turn our deserts around." So I didn't really believe him, actually, but I came down to Mexico, and then I saw with my own eyes. I'm going to do a quick screen share and just show you guys. And what's happening here is an agave plant is being harvested. It's being you can see the gentleman who's leveling it out in a wheelbarrow. It's being shredded up. And then what happens is it's fermented for a month. And down below, you can see the goats eating the agave, the fermented agave. So animals in nature, don't touch agave. It has too many saponins and acids. But once it's fermented, they'll eat it. And also, these are former grasslands. There's still some grass, but not as much due to mismanagement and changing climate. The agave grows adjacent to desert pricker bushes that fix nitrogen called huisache and mesquite. And over a course of 10 years, agave can make 1 hectare can result in 50 tons of animal feed. And a tremendous amount of 200 tons of sequestered carbon dioxide on 1 hectare over 10 years. So creating although that carbon would kind of be eaten up, there's so much land to plant that we could be planting agave for the next 50 years across up to 500 million acres or 1 billion acres of land that can almost do anything, feeding animals, sequestering carbon. And incidentally, around the base of the agave, grasses do start to come back. It brings water to the surface. So Hudson Carbon is working with Regeneration International and building the scientific quantification methodology to measure how much carbon, biodiversity, and water infiltration, to measure the impacts of the agave plant, of different types of agave plantings in different parts of Mexico. So our methodology includes, first we harvested agaves and dried them and figured out how much carbon was in agaves of different sizes and species, and then multiplied that out per hectare. Now we're applying that same analysis using drone technology that measures the width, height of the agaves, the number of pencas, and we're using drones to measure agaves that we're then harvesting and getting carbon data on. We're building an artificial intelligence program to process drone imagery from landscapes to say how much carbon is in the agave there. And we're working with some international registries to register a desert agriculture methodology built around interplanting agave into desert environments. So we're doing this to support Regeneration International, and together we're going to be onboarding some ejidos and projects in Mexico to sell carbon credits for them over this next 2 years. And so this is really Ronnie's dream, and we're working using all our best skills of measuring and scientific research and doing some advising on planting patterns and landscape design to put the agave in, to come up with an overall methodology to sell carbon credits and ecosystem service assets from stakeholders in Mexico. So I actually feel that this could be a whole new page in the history of Regeneration International in finding a way to really help solve some of the biggest problems on the most degraded land in the world.
Yeah, it's quite miraculous. It's really amazing. We're going to be, in the next segment, we're going to be showing a little video from the Mexico Agave Project when Ronnie comes in. But I think the next person we're going to talk to is Will Harris. And Will Harris has a diversified animal operation in Georgia. And he gets plenty of rain, has gorgeous grass, and he's got a really amazing stacked enterprise where he has goats, chickens, cows, just about every farm animal you can imagine, and he's usually using holistic planned grazing, and he's sequestering a lot of carbon. You probably know about white oak pastures, Ben.
I visited Will 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm honored to be speaking on the same program as Will. He's truly a hero to us all.
Hey, and it's Will Harris. Welcome.
I'm also a big fan of Ben and his work, and honored to be here with you all today. Thank you for your good work, Ben.
Thank you, Will. It's terrific to see you.
Will, before we get into your panel we're doing a panel on NEAT, from climate pollution to climate solution. But before we go there, if you have a question or comments on what Ben just showed us about carbon credits, how do you see that fitting into your operation, if at all?
I think that at White Oak Pastures, we, like many other farmers, are making contributions to ecological services that we're not rewarded for. That's okay. We didn't make the changes we made to be paid for ecological services, but we also operate on very, very, very thin margins. And folks that have been in it for a while, like us, are able to survive and maybe even prosper on these thin margins. But the many, many people that I hope will move towards this management system certainly need to be paid for the good they're doing. So I feel like carbon credits and ecological services payments are kind of like unicorns. You hear a lot about them, but I've never actually seen one. And I've heard a lot about this kind of funding, but I don't personally know anyone who has cashed a check. And for the sake of all of us, and particularly the people that want to come into this model, this food production model, despite the tight margins, I hope we see these things compensated for one day. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear. I agree with all of that. Well, Will, thank you so much for being here. I thought I would introduce you not by giving a traditional bio, but by showing our viewers the fantastic, a shortened version of the fantastic movie that Peter Bick made about White Oak Pastures and the work that you do there. It's called 100,000 Beating Hearts. And my coworker, Corey, working behind the scenes to make this magic happen. I ask you, Corey, to show us that film if it's ready and queued up. Well, I'm going to put a note in here in the chat for Corey to show this. But in the meantime, could you tell us how you met Peter Bick, the filmmaker, and how this film came about?
So Peter Bick is a gifted filmmaker. He's a professor at Arizona State University, and he has a passion for regenerative agriculture. He first found my good friend Gabe Brown, who is a farmer in Bismarck, North Dakota. Gabe wrote a book called Dirt to Soil that's doing really well. And Peter did the first Carbon Cowboy, the first film in the Carbon Cowboy series on Gabe and several other farmers, mostly in the maybe Canada, upper Great Plains. And it seemed to catch traction and do well. And I guess he found other funding, and he did the one on us. And it's a little different. The three basic tenets for us at White Oak Pastures is regenerative land management, compassionate animal welfare, and rebuilding this impoverished rural community that we're part of. And Peter focused the one that he did on us more on the community re-enrichment side. And I'm very pleased that he did. It's industrial, commoditized, centralized agriculture rendered rural America, rural communities economically irrelevant. They simply weren't needed anymore. And like any entity or individual that becomes irrelevant, it will waste away. It will cease to be. If you stop using your arms and legs, they won't be strong anymore. And when the that whole production system caught traction the way it did after World War II. It just impoverished rural America. And the changes that we made in managing the land and the animals were very intentional. We didn't like what we were doing. We studied how to do it differently. We implemented changes. Some worked, some didn't. The ones that didn't, we studied again and re-implemented. Some worked, some didn't, and so on. The changes that we made with the community were very unintentional, happened very organically. Had no idea that we could ever impact the impoverishment, because all my life, my town had been wasting away. So I didn't think we could do anything about it. But when we changed the way we farm, I went from 4 minimum wage employees to 180 employees that make well above the county average. County average sucks, but they make above the county average. And when a lot of those people came here to be here. A lot of them weren't from here. They weren't Southern. They weren't rural. They weren't farm. They look more like you than me, Alexis. And when we brought those young, passionate, educated, energetic, hardworking people here, they needed a place to eat and sleep and drink and play and shop and live. So we provided it, and kind of looked up one day and said, this is a nice little town. And it has become a bit of a destination. It's gone from literally a ghost town to a little bit of a destination in a 15-year period. And I'm very, and it was done with bank debt by a C student. I mean, it's highly replicatable. So I hope that we'll see more of that in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Will. I think we're ready to roll this video. It's Peter Bick's movie about Will Harris's farm, White Oak Pastures. It's called 100,000 Beating Hearts.
When I was a full-time commodity cowboy, all I thought about was how many pounds of beef I could squeeze out of this farm at the lowest possible price, with no real focus except pounds of beef and how cheap I can do it. Today, I never ever think about how many pounds we can sell. What I think about all day, every day is, how can I make this land better? What if I put compost this way? What if I put a cover crop that way? What if I graze it in a different way? What can I do to make that happen? We're standing here on my farm in the edge of Bluffton, Georgia. It's one of the poorest counties in the nation. Wonderful land, wonderful climate, and poor people. The census says 102 people. We can't count but about 50. The only thing you can buy in Bluffton is a stamp if you get there between 8 and 12 during the week. If you need a gallon of milk or a tube of toothpaste, it's 12 miles to the store. And what happened to Bluffton is what happened to so many small rural towns that had a purely agrarian economy. With the centralization of industrial agriculture, it simply wasn't needed anymore. There was no economic reason for this town to be here, so people moved to places where they could get better jobs. As far as the impoverishment of rural America, nobody of my father's generation said, let's just suck all the money out of this little town and let it dry up and blow away. That never happened. My father told me that in 1946, a salesman invited all the farmers to a fish fry, and he brought 200-pound bags of ammonium nitrate fertilizer with him. And his ask was, get out in your pasture, put it down in a pattern, and leave it for 3 days and come back and look at it. And when my father came back, the grass was this much higher than the other grass. You know what he said? He said, shit, I want my whole farm to look like that. And we put nitrogen fertilizer on every acre of our land every year from 1946 when he was doing it until 1995. What we couldn't see is that ammonium nitrate fertilizer killed the microbial life that fed the soil. It was an unintended consequence. I'm different from most of the people that I know in this sustainable humane food movement, in that I am one of the good old boys that produced food industrially, and then I went commando. And I still talk to those people. They're still my friends. And one of the things that they say is, well, what you're doing is fine, Will, but you can't feed the world like that. And my response is, I don't know that I'm supposed to feed the world. I think I'm supposed to feed my community. Come on, up.
Okay. Wow, that is so tremendous. Well, I never get bored of watching that. I've watched that several times. Ronnie Cummins. We are joined now by Ronnie Cummins. He is my boss at the Organic Consumers Association. He is one of the founding members of Regeneration International, and he created a Mexican sister organization, Via Organica, in San Miguel de Allende. And we've just been talking about the fantastic work that Ronnie has done with Mexican farmers around agave as a feedstock for animals in this incredibly arid climate. Welcome, Ronnie. Sorry, I still cannot hear you. I'll have Corey work with you from behind the scenes to figure out what's going on with your mic. And in the meantime, Will and I will chat. So Will, I did want to bring Ronnie into this discussion because I think that both of you have a similar viewpoint towards the work that you're doing. You're raising fantastically nutritious food. You're doing it in a way that's beneficial to the environment, that's going to make sure that the land can produce food into future generations. But you said it was surprising, but you also have had an amazing economic impact on your communities. And Ronnie is working in Mexico, where the land is very poor and the people are very poor. You at least have great land and plenty of rain. But there are a lot of people in Mexico ready to work. They are from farm families. They are rural people, but the land has just worn itself out. Will, what similarities do you see between, is Regeneration, is it this amazing economic engine? Are you and Ronnie, what you guys are doing, is that unique, or is this something that happens when regeneration happens agriculturally?
I do want to comment on that, Alexis, but first I want to say that I think that a lot of the ills that we're fighting are from technology gone wrong, technology misapplied. And I'm struck today that Ronnie Cummins, who's one of the smartest people I know, I can see his pretty face, but I can't hear his voice. And this C student from the University of Georgia is able to speak. That's a cruel twist of fate with technology. But to comment on what you said is, it's very interesting because I guess Ronnie's in that very brutal climate down there. And I am in what should not be a brittle climate. We get 52, 53 inches of rain a year, and our rain does not come as dry season and monsoon. It comes reasonably evenly spaced throughout the 12 months. So it's not a brittle climate at all on the brittleness scale. But we have desertified the land by the abuse of tillage, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides, to the point that, Ronnie, can you hear it? Can you speak now?
Yeah.
Okay, let me let Ronnie talk. He's got more to say than I do. I'm older than he is, but he's smarter than I am.
Well, good to be with you today.
So, Ronnie, we were just talking about how both you and Will came into this for the regenerative organic ideal of really super nutritious food that's good for people, farming systems that are good for the animals, and something that's good for the earth and will allow us to produce food into the future. But what each of you found was a farming system that had economic benefits for your region. We just showed the fantastic movie by Peter Bick about Will Harris, 100,000 Beating Hearts. And it's about the economic revitalization of what had become virtually a ghost town. And you're doing something similar in Mexico. Would you like to speak to that?
Yes, well, I mean, there's 4 million family farms left in Mexico. That's twice as many as we have in the U.S., even though the population of Mexico is 128 million, and then there's 38 million Mexican people in the United States. So they have a lot of family farms, but according to the government, 91% of these farms are not economically viable. One of the reasons for this is that 86% of Mexican farmers do not have a well, and they are not likely to get one. And 60% of the terrain in Mexico is this arid or semi-arid, near desert type environment, which is very difficult to grow the traditional crops of corn, beans, and squash. And it's very difficult for people to maintain their livestock, partly because you have, like here in north central Mexico, we get rain for 4 months and then we don't get any rain for 8 months. And if you don't have a well, and if you're in a landscape that was deforested over the last, it started 400 years ago with the Spaniards deforesting this area in order to have charcoal for the silver mines. But it continued, and in spite of the fact that small farmers got control of the giant hacienda estates about 100 years ago in the Mexican Revolution, they still never got any support for their agriculture. So what they did was they for survival reasons, they grazed their livestock on this fairly brittle terrain, which once was savanna or grassland with trees, but has now turned into semi-arid, arid landscape. And so it's been a very difficult time for people. The reason there's so many people from Mexico and Central America trying to cross the border into the United States to find work is not because they're lazy and they don't want to work. They want to come to the U.S. and get on welfare or something. It's because it has become nearly impossible to make a living back in their homeland areas, their farming communities. And so what we are excited about, 12 years ago, we started a research farm in Mexico, an organic farm, because we thought that if we just show people how to grow food organically and how to raise animals holistically, that they would pick up on this and start doing this on their farms. Small farmers own the majority of the land in Mexico, but nowadays they have to have jobs in town. They have to have a family member or two that's in the United States or Canada sending back money, and they really don't have the ability to farm full time. I mean, it's similar in a lot of ways in the U.S. with the jobs that farm families have to have. But it's more of a crisis here. The desperation, the drug gangs have moved in and offer to pay the young people decent wages, but they have to kill people and rob and steal and produce, terrible drugs and so on. And so the young people are looking for an alternative, and their parents are still anxious to work the land in a good way. So long and short of it is, through trial and error, some small farmers figured out how to use the native plants that exist in these very harsh terrain in a new kind of way. For indigenous people have known for 10,000 years that you can eat the stalk of the agave plant at the end of its life, and you can utilize the stalk, but it takes 10, 12 years till maturity for that to happen. People, once the Europeans came, they learned how to distill the lightly alcoholic beverage that you get from the agave plant, from the piña or the pineapple. And so they learned how to make mezcal and tequila, drinks familiar to people in the United States. However, this did not solve their major problems. And the way that the tequila industry is being run, it's being run as a monoculture, sort of like a U.S. Industrial farm in the Midwest, where you grow one crop, you spray all kind of pesticides to kill the pests, you put chemical fertilizer on there, you pay the farm workers as little as possible, and a few corporations at the top make off with all the money. And so what these farmers discovered that no one had figured out before was that you got these enormous plants that grow all over Mexico. There's billions of them, agaves, that have most of their biomass is in the leaves, which they call pencas. Now, I mean, one of these leaves in a full-grown plant can weigh 50 pounds. These plants are nearly indestructible. They can grow when it's really hot. They can grow when it's really cold. They can go years without rain, and still they've evolved to survive. But until recently, people didn't know that the leaves, even if you chop them up and try to feed them to your livestock who need this nutrition, especially in the dry season, the 8 months when it doesn't rain, they won't eat them because they have chemicals in them, saponins and lectins, that evolve in evolution because the plant doesn't want to be eaten until it produces the seed stalk at the end of its life. But what they figured out is you chop up these indigestible agave leaves finely in a machine they designed, a relatively low-cost machine, and what you get looks like green coleslaw coming out of the machine right after you chop it up. And you put this green coleslaw in front of a cow or a sheep or pig or goat or a chicken. They're not that interested in it unless they're starving to death. And the reason for that is they can smell and they know what they should eat and what they will not eat. However, you put this in a closed container. I mean, we use either 5-gallon recyclable plastic buckets with a lid, or we use larger 250-gallon barrels. If you close this container for a month, it ferments the agave, and it's not green anymore, it's gold. And you smell it, oh yeah, that smells kind of like sauerkraut or kombucha. Okay, well then you put this out there in front of the animals, and yeah, they sniff around it for a while because it's a new kind of a new thing. But before you know it, they're gobbling it down. They're enjoying it, and they love it. And so you think back, okay, there are millions of tons of these leaves around Mexico that are considered garbage. They're basically burned or thrown into landfills once you harvest the piña or the pineapple part of the plant at the end of its life. But once farmers realize, oh, this isn't garbage at all. This is feed that I can make 2.2 pounds or a kilo for 5 cents US. And hey, I'm paying 6-8 times that amount for corn silage, for alfalfa, and I can grow this stuff myself because it grows out there. It needs no irrigation, and it's a very good for the environment if you grow it in a biodiverse setting. In other words, you don't chop down the pre-existing cactus and other plants, bushes and trees. You plant this amongst them. The plant, the agave, evolved to where it doesn't mind if it's shaded by another plant because it does its photosynthesis at night. You know, almost all plants do their photosynthesis during the day, but this plant does it at night. And so it's a perfect complement to the natural landscape. And then you can plant this pretty much everywhere. So we have about 50 staff on our farm who are mainly young Mexican kids from rural backgrounds, from farming families, or else they went to the university to learn agronomy. And they work on our farm, and they have learned how to do this. And then it's starting to spread throughout our county. It's starting to spread throughout the region. And we believe, I mean, we're getting inquiries now from all over the world, because most people in North America don't realize this, but 40% of the world looks like the arid parts of New Mexico or West Texas. You know, it doesn't look like the Midwest. Most of it looks like what Mexico looks like and what the semi-desert part of the southwestern United States looks like. And it's extremely difficult to make a living in these areas. That's the reason so many people in Africa are trying to migrate into Europe to find jobs. And it's the reason why so many people from the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico would love to get up and earn some money in the United States. But what we've discovered is that the young people in our area and their parents, once they discover that the land they already have, that the livestock they already have, and that the natural plants in the environment can be put to use to where they can actually make a living on their farm, they get very excited. And all of a sudden, they're not talking about going to Houston, you know, to work on a construction crew where they could make 10 or 15 bucks an hour. What they're talking about is how can they turn their families' holdings, and we have these ejidos in Mexico. There's 28,000 of them. They're basically co-ops of land where a rural village owns a bunch of land. They have their private land, each family, but they also own it. They have communal lands where they have typically grazed their animals and unfortunately have overgrazed their animals for the last 100 years. So we think this was a gift from Mother Nature, that just in time, when things were becoming really intolerable and the climate is getting worse and worse, I mean, you can't even grow corn and beans and squash any longer most years. Now, this year was odd around here. We actually got the normal amount of rainfall, but we got the most rain this year in 20 years. And basically, it's been very difficult. So what we are going to do, we call it the Billion Agave Project, is we are inviting farmers from all over Mexico to come to Villa Organica, our organic ranch, and see this process. We're inviting filmmakers and writers, and believe it or not, we're starting to have investors interested. I mean, Nestle Mexico, who definitely is not my favorite corporation. They're the biggest food corporation in the world. They buy the most milk in the whole world. They produce a bunch of junk food, that's for sure. But Nestle came, a team of their animal scientists, and they were blown away by what they saw. And they said, oh my God, we're having a problem all over the world. The cows on the farms that we buy milk from, there's 300,000 farms around the world that Nestle buys milk from. They said they're all having, especially in the global south or south of the border, they're all having tremendous problems. There's not as much grass as there used to be. The animals aren't as healthy as they used to be. The milk production, it's really hard to keep it up. And the price of the feed that they are feeding these animals, often in confined situations. They shouldn't be. They should be grass feeding them. But nonetheless, feed costs are going up. And now they're on the spot because people are looking at them like, wow, Nestle, Cargill, Danone, you guys are climate criminals. You not only squeeze every dime you can out of the farmers you buy from, you have such a carbon footprint that you have put more carbon dioxide and methane, nitrous oxide in the atmosphere than some countries in the world. And so they're anxious to improve their image. And so they talk about, hey, we're going to green up our supply line. And what Nestle told us is we have a huge carbon footprint, as a giant corporation. And most of our carbon footprint is derived from the feed of the animals, in our system. And I mean, in order to get back to grass-fed production, which is what should be the norm, in places like Mexico and 40% of the world that's semi-arid and arid, we're going to need to adapt some of these regenerative principles. So out in the fields where we've planted hundreds of thousands of agaves the last couple of years, right now is the end of the rainy season, but you see that this is definitely not a monoculture that we're talking about. I mean, there's nice grass now where the agaves have been planted. There's companion trees like the mesquites or the agaves that have the pods. They fix nitrogen and nutrients in the soil. There's native cactus, some of which, like the nopal, are actually very good animal feed. And they have the prickly pears, which are of use for a lot of things, all kind of medicinal things. So the environment in a semi-desert area is not devoid of life, but it needs some help to restore the soil, bring back, draw up some of that moisture closer so the grass can grow better. And then you have to we do on a small scale of 75 acres, what Will Harris does on a much larger scale, or what Ben Dobson does. We do this rotational grazing with our sheep and with our goats and with our chickens and our ducks and geese and rabbits. But we do it with solar fencing, and we just move the animals every day. And what we're finding is that if you do that, if you do what Will's doing on a large scale, even on a small scale, you can see the difference. And we are excited, and we are attracting a lot of attention. And this system, because when you're looking at an arid or semi-arid area, there's hardly any carbon above the ground or below the ground. And these native plants can grow into literally a forest without any irrigation. We're looking at massive amounts of carbon being drawn down, the excess carbon from the atmosphere, and put in to the above ground biomass and into the soil. And if you harvest these plants on we harvest 10% a year, so that by the time we've harvested 10%, you still have 90% of the biomass in the pasture, that it can be a continuous system. And we are excited. 2 days ago, I went to a farm where they were using a species of tree that I had only read about because it's from Asia, but a Paulownia. And it was amazing to see these 16-month-old trees in a field of 2,000 agaves that were already like 6-8 feet tall. And they'll be 12 feet tall in another year. And the leaves, I watched in amazement. They have giant leaves, and I watched some cows chowing down on these leaves, and they love them. And it would be like dessert if they got to eat their the grass, and then the fermented agave, and then the leaves from these paulownia trees. And so every day we're getting new hints, new advice. And I think this system, this regenerative and organic system, which is a really, it's agroforestry, but it's also holistic livestock management, is going to provide a tremendous benefit to, the billion people who live in these semi-arid, arid areas around the world. And we're hoping we can eliminate poverty as we stabilize the climate and rebuild the environment. And we're going to have healthy soils, healthy animals, healthy people, healthy environments, and hopefully global cooperation instead of global belligerence, so that we can move forward.
Thanks, Ronnie. And I want to go back to Will, something you were saying before Ronnie joined us about how your climate in Georgia doesn't have the same challenges that the climate that Ronnie is working with in Mexico. But because of hyper-industrialization, all of the chemical fertilizers, all of the plowing, the disregard for the natural systems, it has become brittle in similar ways to what Ronnie is describing, where we had in Mexico, there was deforestation and then overgrazing, and then you ended up with an extremely brittle system that has to be carefully revived. But in Georgia, you can see that too with the hyper-industrialization. Can you go on and talk more about what you were getting at there?
A lot of what Ronnie was talking about is fascinating to me. I didn't know the ecological history of that ecosystem he's in Mexico. But I have always been aware, long been aware, that every ecosystem is different. And a hero of mine is Wendell Berry. And one of the things Mr. Berry says, and I'll misquote him, but there's no way to place a value on how much a farmer knows about his land, or what a farmer knows about his land. And while all of the fundamentals are the same, no matter what your ecosystem is, it's very different. The fundamentals for me are the cycles of nature, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the energy cycle, the mineral cycle, the microbial cycle, on and on, cycles we don't even know about. But to compare what I have here to what the ecosystem Ronnie's in down there would be, just be like two different planets. But what is similar is the degradation that has occurred in both ecosystems based on the land management. This was the savanna. That was the historical ecosystem here. It was farmed without a lot of technology until prior to World War II. Post World War II, a tremendous amount of the war efforts technology was repurposed, and was such powerful technologies that actually, at least in the short run, broke the cycles of nature. I was mentioning before Ronnie got on the tillage, chemical fertilizer, pesticides on the land, on the animals, pesticides, wormers, hormone implants. And it literally broke the cycles of nature, so that the abundance of nature was no longer there. I have a neighbor who farms very industrially. The organic matter in his soil is 0.5%. I checked it. My land right across the fence is over 5%. And that took 20 plus years to get it there, but it's there. And to give you a sense of what that means, generally 1 inch or 1% organic matter will hold a 1 inch rain event. So if we get a 5 inch rain event, my land will absorb, and we get 5 inch rain events in the Gulf Coast. My land will absorb the 5 inches of rain if it comes slowly. My neighbor's land right beside it will take absorb half an inch of that rain. So 4.5 inches washes on down and does harm in the waterways of the Gulf of Mexico. And we call that desertification. No matter how much rain you get, if you can't hold but tiny amounts, incremental amounts of it, the land becomes desertified. It seems incredible that land in the Gulf Coast can be desertified, but we've done it. And we've reversed that process here by what we call biomimicry, the emulation of nature. We use a lot of animal impact on our farm. We pasture raise cows, hogs, sheep, goats, rabbits. And we pasture raise chickens, turkeys, geese, guineas, and ducks. And an essential element of the production is movement, constant movement. We emulating the buffalo across the Great Plains being pushed, slowly chased by wolves. The effect would be hard animal impact on the land. They would eat shoulder to shoulder, bunched for safety in numbers. They're prey animals, eating it all down to very short. Most photosynthesizing tissue would be eaten off, but they would have a very long recovery time. And when Ronnie was talking about taking those leaves and grinding them and feeding them to the animals, what I thought about is the benefit that must have to the microbes in the soil, because suddenly that plant material, after it comes out the back of that ruminant animal, becomes a wonderful microbe feed to build microbes in the soil. And that's so essential. One of the worst of the many damages we've done with technology in this kind of farming is the degradation of the microbial population. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but my point was by mimicking nature in this ecosystem, which is very different from the one Ronnie's in, we've made tremendous progress towards restarting those cycles of nature, and we're really enjoying the abundance that comes from that.
Nice. Thank you so much, Will. And thank you, Ronnie. I think we're going to close this session. So Will Harris, Ronnie Cummins, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and wit with us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having us.
Beautiful. So we were going to have Reginaldo Hazlet-Marroquin with us, but he was not able to make it. We do have a short clip of what he does with regenerative poultry. And so I'd like to show that. Thanks so much, Ronnie. Thanks for making this happen. Thanks for everything you do for Regeneration International. It's been a great time so far.
Okay. Thank you, Alex.
So one thing we get wrong in this society is the idea of scale. So we think the current agricultural system produces food at scale. But if you stop for a second, before us humans took over the earth, the scale at which food was produced and distributed equally across all of the living systems on the earth was, hundreds of levels of magnitude greater than what we do today. Understanding that is central to being able to set the mind forward and all the technology and scientific knowledge that we have today, managerial and otherwise, so that we can then regenerate at scale. By raising chickens, we can bring a easily accessible, culturally compatible, economically feasible, globally applicable blueprint so that we can scale one sector. And that is how we chose chickens. The smallest units of production for our poultry is 1.5 acres. The average size of a small farm, of which there is over 500 million globally, is only 25 acres, which means we could put multiple production units on every single farm on earth. And that is why we pick chickens, because it gives us the most scalable opportunity to demonstrate that, one, animals don't have to live in confinement for us to have meat. That, two, we don't need to destroy the ecology. In fact, it is by rebuilding and regenerating it that we deliver the food we need in the world. And 3, that people and ecology and our lifestyles don't have to be at odds with each other. We can live comfortable lives without destroying the planet. In fact, we won't have our lives if we keep going this way. And chickens gave us the formula, literally, not only for the engineering blueprint, but also for the social structuring, for large-scale organizing, for economic modeling, and for demonstrating at a large scale how you change an industry.
Hello, hello. I'm Alexis Badenmare with Regeneration International and Organic Consumers Association. And we've had a few of our panelists so far talking about the magic of regenerative agriculture. And across the bottom of the screen, you've probably noticed that we have a ticker: sign the Regeneration Pledge. Let your nation's leaders know you want them to invest in regenerative agriculture. regenerationinternational.org/pledge. And so this is a simple pledge that you can sign. It's a way of you joining into Regeneration International. So go to regenerationinternational.org/pledge and you can join the movement. We also encourage people who represent organizations to make applications to become part of Regeneration International. In past years, we have had in-person conventions globally, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. We want to do that again very soon. And so please sign up, get your organization involved, and hopefully when we do a future in-person event, we can meet one another in person.